Coming over. In the years around the turn of the century, immigration to America reached an all-time high. Between 1880 and 1920, 23 million immigrants arrived in the United States. They mainly came from countries of Europe, especially from impoverished towns and villages in southern and eastern Europe. The one thing they had in common was a fervent belief that in America, life would be better. Most of these immigrants were poor. Somehow they managed to scrape together enough money to pay for their passage to America. Many immigrant families arrived penniless. Others had to make a journey in stages. Often the father came first, found work, and sent for his family later. Immigrants usually crossed the Atlantic as steerage passengers. Reached by steep, slippery stairways, the steerage lay deep down in the hold of the ship. It was occupied by passengers paying the lowest fare. Men, women, and children packed into dark, foul-smelling compartments. They slept in narrow bunks stacked 3 high. They had no showers, no lounges, and no dining rooms. Food served from huge kettles was dished into dinner pails provided by the steamship company. Because steerage conditions were crowded and uncomfortable, passengers spent as much time as possible up on deck. The voyage was an ordeal, but it was worth it. They were on their way to America. The great majority of immigrants landed in New York City, at America's busiest port. They never forgot their first glimpse at the Statue of Liberty. Edward Corsi, who later became United States Commissioner of Immigration, was a 10-year-old Italian immigrant when he sailed to New York Harbor in 1907. My first impressions of the New World will always remain etched in my memory, particularly that hazy morning when I first saw Ellis Island. The steamer Florida, 14 days out of Naples, filled to capacity with 1,600 natives of Italy, had weathered one of the worst storms in our captain's memory, and glad we're here, both children and grown-ups, to leave the open sea and come at last through the Narrows into the bay. My mother, my stepfather, my brother Giuseppe, and my 2 sisters, Liberta and Helvetia, all of us together, happy that we had come through the storm safely, clustered on the foredeck for fear of separation and looked with wonder at this miraculous land of our dreams. Giuseppe and I held tightly to our stepfather's hands, while Liberta and Helvetia clung to mother. Passengers all about us were crowding against the rail. Jabbered conversation, sharp cries, laughs, and cheers. A steadily rising din filled the air. Mothers and fathers lifted up babies so that they could see too. Off to the left, the Statue of Liberty. Finally, the Florida veered to the left, turning in northward into the Hudson River, and now the incredible buildings of Lower Manhattan came very close to us. The officers of the ship went striding up and down the deck shouting orders and directions, driving the immigrants before them. Scowling and gesturing, they pushed and pulled the passengers, herding us into separate groups as though we were animals. A few moments later, we came to our dock, and the long journey was over. But the journey was not over yet. Before they could be admitted to the United States, immigrants had to pass through Ellis Island, which became the nation's chief immigrant processing center in 1892. There they would be questioned and examined. Those who did not pass all the exams would be detained. Some would be sent back to Europe, and so their arrival in America was filled with great anxiety. Among the immigrants, Ellis Island was known as Heartbreak Island. When their ship docked at a Hudson River pier, the immigrants had numbered identity tags pinned to their clothing. Then they were herded onto special ferry boats that carried them to Ellis Island. Officials hurried them along. Quick, run, hurry, in a half a dozen languages. Filling into an enormous inspection hall, the immigrants formed long lines separated by iron railings that made the hall look like a great maze. Now the examinations began. The first immigrants were examined by 2 doctors of the United States Health Services. One doctor looked for physical and mental abnormalities. When a case aroused suspicion, the immigrant received a chalk mark on the right shoulder for further inspection. L for lameness, H for heart, X for mental defects, and so on. The second doctor watched for contagious and infectious diseases. He looked especially for infections of the scalp and at the eyelids for symptoms of trachoma, a blinding disease. Since trachoma caused more than half of all medical detentions, this doctor was greatly feared. He stood directly in the immigrant's path. With a swift movement, he would grab the immigrant's eyelid, pull it up, and peer beneath it. If all was well, the immigrant passed along. Those who failed to get past both doctors had to undergo a more thorough medical exam. The others moved on to a registration clerk, who questioned them with the aid of an interpreter. What is your name, your nationality, your occupation? Can you read or write? Have you ever been to prison? How much money do you have with you? Where are you going? Some immigrants were so flustered that they could not answer. They were allowed to sit and rest and try again. About one immigrant out of every 5 or 6 was detained for additional examinations or questioning. The writer Angelo Pellegrini recalled his family's own detention at Ellis Island. We lived there for 3 days, mother and 5 children, the youngest of whom was 3 years old. Because of the rigorous physical examination that we have to submit to, particularly of the eyes, there was this terrible anxiety that one of us might be rejected. And if one of us was, what might the rest of the family do? My sister was indeed momentarily rejected. She had been so ill and had cried so much that her eyes were absolutely bloodshot, and mother was told, well, we can't let her in. But fortunately, mother was an indomitable spirit, and finally made them understand that if her child had a few hours rest and a little bite to eat, she would be all right. In the end, we did get through.